In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, welcome to The Missing Dots. Tonight on The Missing Dots, we step into one of the most debated chapters of South Asian Islamic history, the rise of the Ahl-i Hadith movement, not to praise, not to condemn, but to investigate with academic honesty. How it emerged, what forces shaped it, who led it, what ideas it championed, how it influenced Muslim thought, and why it continues to spark questions across believers, skeptics, and scholars alike. And as we explore its origins, motives, impact, criticisms, and modern-day relevance, we also confront the uncomfortable, the unspoken, and the taboo, the questions people whisper but never ask aloud, because here, silence ends and inquiry begins.
Thank you. I mean, it is quite an introduction, but it really captures the weight of what we are unpacking today.
Yeah.
We have this massive and, exhaustive academic research paper in front of us.
Yeah.
It is structured around 100 critical questions.
Yeah, 100 questions is no joke.
Right. And it looks at the Ahl-i Hadith movement from, basically every angle you can think of: historical, theological, sociological, even political.
And the thing is, this isn't just a history lesson about a bunch of people from 200 years ago. We are talking about a movement that represents roughly 3 to 3.5% of the global Muslim population right now.
Exactly. Which is somewhere between 59 and 64 million people.
That is huge. And they are mostly concentrated in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, but they also have this massive, highly active diaspora all around the entire world.
Which is why our mission today is to objectively look at this really complex group. We aren't here to take sides. We aren't here to pass judgment. We are simply going to examine the historical facts of how it emerged, the specific theology it pushes, and the really intense debates it provokes.
Because to truly understand the religious landscape of South Asia today, you kind of have to understand the Ahl-i Hadith.
You absolutely have to. You have to understand the friction it creates with other Islamic sects and the critiques leveled against it by, secular scholars and religious opponents alike.
So to really grasp the gravity of this, I think we have to travel back to 19th century colonial India, and we need to feel what the people were feeling on the ground.
Yeah, we have to put ourselves in their shoes. We're talking about the period leading up to and immediately following the 1857 Indian Rebellion.
The Muslims in South Asia didn't just lose a military conflict there, they basically lost their entire world.
The psychological devastation, honestly, it cannot be overstated. I mean, for centuries, the Mughal Empire was the undisputed political and cultural powerhouse of that entire region.
Muslims were the ruling elite.
Exactly. But by the mid-19th century, that empire essentially collapsed, and it culminated in the British absolutely crushing the 1857 rebellion.
Right.
The British didn't just take over the government. They totally dismantled the Muslim social order.
Give me an example of what that actually looked like for a normal person.
Well, think about language. Persian was the language of the Muslim courts, of literature, of administration, and it was just replaced by English.
Wow, just overnight.
Pretty much. The traditional justice system was dismantled. Wealthy Muslim landowners suddenly had their estates confiscated.
So you go from being the ruling class, speaking the language of power, to being subjects in a foreign empire, completely alienated from the courts, the economy, and the new educational system.
Right. It was a profound spiritual crisis. SubhanAllah, when people face that level of societal destruction, they look for reasons.
They don't just shrug it off.
No, they looked around at the ruins of their empire and asked this really terrifying theological question. Why has God allowed this to happen to us?
And the answer they arrived at, according to the sources, it had absolutely nothing to do with British military superiority or, industrial economics.
Not at all. For the reformers who would eventually shape the Ahl-i Hadith movement, the answer was entirely spiritual. They concluded that this decline happened because Muslims had strayed from true Islam.
True Islam meaning what exactly?
Well, they looked out at the popular religious practices of the time, the really elaborate rituals at Sufi shrines, the blending of local Hindu customs with Islamic practices, and they saw massive cultural syncretism.
So they thought they were being punished.
Exactly. They believed the community was being actively punished by God for abandoning the pure, unadulterated message of the Prophet Muhammad.
The thing is, it sounds like they were trying to hit a massive factory reset button on religion. Like they looked at the operating system of South Asian Islam, saw all these cultural bugs and glitches, and just wanted to wipe the hard drive back to its original state.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it, actually. But the intellectual groundwork for that reset, it didn't just start in a vacuum after 1857.
Right, it goes back further.
Yeah, it was laid much earlier by a really towering intellectual figure named Shah Waliullah Dahlawi. He lived from 1703 to 1762.
So way before the full collapse.
Yes. He saw the early cracks in the Mughal Empire, and he emphasized a return to Hadith-based reform to save the community. But the kinetic energy, the actual spark of the movement that came a bit later with figures like Syed Ahmad Barelvi and Shah Ismail Delvi.
And the sources show they didn't start by writing pamphlets, right? They started with swords.
They really did. In the 1820s and 30s, they led an armed movement. It was called the Tariqa-e-Muhammadiyya.
Who were they fighting? The British.
Initially, they fought against Sikh rule in the northwest of the subcontinent. It was a militant, desperate attempt to carve out and establish a purified Islamic state.
But it didn't work.
No, it ended in absolute disaster. Both Syed Ahmad and Shah Ismail were killed at the Battle of Balakot in 1831.
So the mud and the blood of Balakot basically crushed the idea of military salvation. How do you go from a failed military uprising to a massive scholarly movement?
The survivors and the subsequent generation of scholars, they realized a really harsh truth. Armed struggle was futile, especially with the British tightening their grip across the entire region.
The movement had to adapt or just die out.
Exactly. So it was institutionalized by two pivotal figures who basically traded the sword for the pen. Sayyid Nazir Hussain Dehlawi in Delhi and Nawab Siddiq Hasan Khan of Bhopal.
And what did they do differently?
They shifted the entire focus of the movement to education, publishing, and preaching.
But honestly, how do you just erase centuries of established tradition? Even if you shift to education, weren't everyday people incredibly resistant to just throwing away the way their ancestors practiced their faith for hundreds of years?
Oh, there was massive resistance from the traditional establishment. But the research points out something really crucial here. The factory reset was incredibly appealing to a very specific demographic.
Which was?
The educated urban Muslims.
Why them? Why did it appeal to the city folks?
Well, the traditional religious establishment, primarily the Hanafi scholars of the time, were increasingly perceived by the urban elite as intellectually stagnant. They were relying on these centuries-old legal manuals that just seemed completely disconnected from their rapidly changing world under British rule.
That makes sense.
And furthermore, the popular Sufi practices at the time were financially draining.
Wait, financially draining? How so?
Hosting elaborate death anniversaries for saints, traveling long distances to shrines, paying shrine custodians for intercessory prayers. These were expensive, really heavy cultural obligations.
Wow, so it's actually pretty simple when you look at it economically.
Very much so. The Ahl-i Hadith message cut right through all of that. It was revolutionary in its simplicity.
What was the pitch, basically?
They essentially told the masses, you don't need a shrine custodian to speak to God for you. You don't need to pay for these massive cultural festivals. And you don't need to blindly follow a medieval jurist.
Just you and the text.
Exactly. You just need the Quran and the authenticated words of the Prophet. It democratized the religion while simultaneously cutting all the financial and cultural bloat.
That leads us perfectly into the absolute core of their theology, which the sources highlight as their most defining feature. Let's talk about the concept of taqlid.
This is the theological earthquake of the movement. For centuries, the vast majority of Sunni Muslims practiced taqlid.
Which translates to what, exactly?
It roughly translates to blind adherence or following. It means the adherence to one of the four major established schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, or Hanbali schools. In South Asia, the Hanafi school was and remains massively dominant.
Let me make sure I have this straight. For the average farmer or merchant in 19th century Lahore, if they had a question about how to wash before prayer or how to write a valid business contract, they didn't go read the Quran themselves.
No, absolutely not.
They went to a local scholar who gave them the established ruling from the Hanafi school.
Precisely. The heavy lifting of interpreting the primary text had already been done by brilliant scholars centuries ago.
Right.
But the Ahl-i Hadith looked at this system and totally rejected it. They argued that the four great classical imams never demanded blind obedience, and that forcing everyday believers to follow a specific school was actually a deviation from early Islam.
So what did they propose instead?
They championed ijtihad.
Which means independent reasoning.
Yes. They believed that any qualified individual should bypass the centuries of human legal commentary and derive religious rulings directly from the primary sources of the Quran and authenticated Hadith.
But I never thought about it that way. Doesn't telling everyone to bypass the scholars and interpret the primary texts themselves lead to total anarchy? I mean, if everyone is their own judge, who decides what the law actually is?
You are echoing the exact panic of the traditional scholars of the time. The established schools of law don't just exist for tradition's sake, they exist to prevent chaos.
Right. They have a system.
Exactly. They utilize something called usul al-fiqh, which are the principles of jurisprudence.
We need to unpack that for a second. What is usul al-fiqh in plain English?
Think of it like the difference between a recipe book and the underlying science of baking.
Okay, I like that analogy.
The Quran and Hadith give you ingredients. Usul al-fiqh is the complex scientific methodology of how those ingredients actually interact. It tells a scholar how to weigh conflicting evidence, how to understand the historical context of a verse, and how to apply a ruling when two texts seem to directly contradict each other.
So the traditionalists were saying you can't just hand a raw ingredient to a layman and expect them to bake the cake.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
The critics argued that if you strip away the methodology of the classical schools, you don't get purity. You open the floodgates to ignorant ijtihad.
Meaning people just making things up based on a translated sentence.
Yes, you get fragmentation, where every individual with a translated book of Hadith thinks they have the authority to issue fatwas.
And this bypassing of tradition didn't stop at the law books either. It extended directly into the spiritual lives of the people. The sources detail a literal war on bid'ah, which means religious innovation, and shirk, which is polytheism.
This was undeniably their most socially disruptive stance. They looked at the deeply entrenched, really vibrant Sufi culture of South Asia and declared an ideological war on it.
What exactly were they targeting?
They condemned tawassul, which is the practice of visiting the graves of saints to ask for their intercession with God. They condemned the leers, the massive, colorful celebrations of saints' death anniversaries.
Wow, even those.
Oh, yeah. They even condemned the Mawlid, the celebration of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday.
Because to the Ahl-i Hadith, none of that was in the original source code of the religion.
Right. If the Prophet and his immediate companions didn't do it, doing it now was an unlawful innovation. Or worse, they argued it was polytheism, because directing any form of devotion, even asking for a prayer, to someone in a grave diverted worship away from God alone.
This strict literalist textual approach also applied to their view of God himself, right? The research calls this the Ahl-i Creed.
The Ahl-i Creed is fundamentally literalist, and to really understand it, we have to look at the broader debates in Islamic history.
Okay, set the scene for us.
For centuries, theologians argued over how to interpret descriptions of God in the Quran. When the text mentions God's hand or God's face, the rationalist schools like the Mutazilites or the Asharis stepped in.
Let's pause and define those. Who are the Mutazilites and Asharis?
They were theological schools that believed human reason was absolutely essential to understanding God. The Mutazilites were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and believed God's law must align with human logic.
And the Asharis?
The Asharis came later as a sort of middle ground, but they still heavily used philosophical reasoning. So when these rationalist schools read about God having a hand, they said, well, this must be a metaphor.
Like, it just means power.
Exactly. It means God's power or God's blessing because a physical hand implies God is like a human, which is impossible.
But the Ahl-i Hadith totally reject that rationalization.
Completely. They adopt the Athari approach, which uses an Arabic phrase, bila kayf. It means without asking how. They say you accept the text exactly as it is transmitted. You affirm that God has a hand because the text says so, but you do not try to imagine it physically, and you absolutely do not explain it away with human metaphors.
So it's no philosophy at all.
It is a total rejection of philosophical theology, God's word over human logic, period.
But if you take a theology that rigid and you apply it to a society where millions of people are celebrating saints and visiting shrines, that friction is going to cause a massive explosion.
It did. It really did.
You can't just declare the daily spiritual practices of your neighbors to be polytheism and expect them to sit quietly. This brings us to the sectarian battlefield. Enter the Barelvis and the Deobandis.
The ideological collision was intense and it was immediate. Let's look at the Barelvi movement first, which was founded by the scholar Ahmad Raza Khan.
What was their core belief?
The Barelvi tradition is deeply infused with Sufi spirituality. They believe heavily in the intercessory power of saints and hold a profound, almost cosmic veneration for the Prophet Muhammad.
So when the Ahl-i Hadith came along and called these practices shirk, the Barelvis must have been horrified.
They felt the Ahl-i Hadith were stripping the very soul out of the religion. They accused the Ahl-i Hadith of fundamentally disrespecting the Prophet by focusing so aggressively on his ordinary human nature and stripping away the veneration.
They saw it as cold.
Exactly. To the Barelvis, the Ahl-i Hadith vision of Islam was cold, dry, hyper-legalistic, and dangerously arrogant.
And then you have the Deobandis. Now, they are a really interesting piece of this puzzle because they actually shared some DNA with the Ahl-i Hadith.
He did.
They also wanted to reform Islam and strip away some of the excesses of popular culture, right?
Yes. The Deobandis also wanted to cleanse South Asian Islam of certain syncretic practices. But the crucial defining difference is that the Deobandis were and are fierce, uncompromising defenders of the Hanafi school of law.
Ah, so they still believed in Taqlid.
Strongly. They believed you reform society through strict adherence to the established classical tradition, not by burning the tradition down.
So they didn't like the factory reset idea at all.
No, they looked at the Ahl-i Hadith's rejection of Taqlid and saw nothing but misguided chaos and disrespect for 1,000 years of scholarship.
Which inevitably leads to the elephant in the room, the Wahhabi label. The British colonizers used it to describe them. Their religious critics used it. So were the Ahl-i Hadith just importing Saudi Arabian religion into the Indian subcontinent?
The nuance here is really critical. Historically, calling them Wahhabis was initially a colonial smear tactic.
Why would the British do that?
The British wanted to associate these Indian reformers with the rebellious anti-Ottoman Wahhabi movement in the Arabian Peninsula to paint them as a political threat. The research is clear on this. The Ahl-i Hadith movement is fundamentally an indigenous South Asian phenomenon.
It grew out of their own local issues.
Right. It grew out of the legacy of Shah Waliullah and the socio-political crisis of 1857.
But they do share an awful lot of theological DNA with the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia.
Absolutely, which is why the label stuck so well. They share a fierce, uncompromising emphasis on absolute monotheism, the violent rejection of shrines, and the sole reliance on primary texts.
So they reached the same conclusions independently.
Mostly, yes. The South Asian movement had its own distinct founders, its own historical trauma, and its own unique trajectory.
Though the sources mentioned that the lines got incredibly blurry later on.
They did, specifically starting in the 1970s. The global geopolitical landscape shifted, and you see massive infusions of Saudi petrodollars pouring into South Asia.
How did that change things on the ground?
This funding built Ahl-i Hadith madrasas, funded their publications, and strengthened their network exponentially. When you combine that funding with generations of South Asian scholars traveling to study at the Islamic University of Medina, much of the South Asian Ahl-i Hadith identity practically merged with global Arabian Salafism.
Now, this environment of intense debate wasn't just academic sparring in libraries. It got deeply personal and destructive on the ground. The sources detail the reality of mutual takfir.
Takfir is the act of declaring another Muslim to be an unbeliever or an apostate. It is the nuclear option in Islamic theology.
How did that actually affect daily life? I mean, if I'm a farmer in a village in 1890, what does takfir actually mean for me?
It shatters your entire social reality. If an Ahl-i Hadith scholar declares that a specific Sufi practice is polytheism, they are saying the people doing it are no longer Muslims.
That is heavy.
On the ground, this meant families were literally torn apart. It meant you couldn't pray behind an imam of a different sect. It meant marriages between sects could be annulled because a Muslim cannot legally be married to a polytheist.
Wow, it really broke the community.
It even meant you couldn't eat meat slaughtered by someone from the opposing group. The
Yeah.
social fabric of entire villages was ripped apart.
And the traditionalists fired back with their own nuclear option.
Oh, ferociously. In 1906, a famous fatwa called Husamul Haramain was issued by Ahmad Raza Khan. He actually took it to Mecca and Medina and got it signed by prominent scholars there.
What did the fatwa say?
This fatwa explicitly declared the founders of both the Deobandi and Ahl-i Hadith movements to be heretics. It was a complete theological arms race of excommunication.
Let's step back from the sectarian clashes for a moment and look at this from a philosophical angle, because the research highlights a massive paradox sitting right in the middle of the Ahl-i Hadith ideology.
It is a fascinating paradox.
They claim to have reopened the doors of Ittihad, the doors of critical, independent thinking, by telling people not to blindly follow the medieval scholars. But did this movement actually produce freethinkers?
If we place them within the broader scope of Islamic intellectual history, the answer is largely no. Not in the philosophical sense, anyway.
Why not?
The reason comes down to what scholars call their epistemological ceiling.
Epistemological ceiling meaning a strict limit on how they believe human beings can actually acquire valid knowledge.
Precisely. Their version of free thinking is strictly and exclusively bounded by textual literalism. In classical Islamic theology, there is a historical ongoing tension between naql, which is transmitted textual knowledge, and aql, which is human reason.
And the Ahl-i Hadith put all their chips on naql, text over everything.
100%. Because they vehemently reject speculative philosophy, they reject the rationalist theology of the Mutazilites and Ash'aris, and they even reject qiyas, which is the analogical reasoning used in traditional Islamic law.
Wait, how does a legal system function without analogical reasoning? If a new drug is invented today, a traditional scholar might use qiyas to compare its intoxicating effects to alcohol, which is forbidden in the Quran, and rule the new drug forbidden.
Exactly. That's classical qiyas. You take a known ruling and apply the underlying logic to a new situation.
But the Ahl-i Hadith don't do that.
The Ahl-i Hadith are highly skeptical of that human analogical leap. They demand direct textual evidence. By restricting themselves so severely to the literal text, they heavily limit their intellectual toolkit.
So you can think, but only within a very small box.
Right. You are free to think, but your thinking is restricted to authenticating a chain of narration or extracting a literal ruling from a specific historical sentence.
That rigid ceiling explains why they aren't producing the next great philosopher or someone who reconciles religion with modern sociology.
No, they don't produce philosophers. They produce incredibly rigorous hadith specialists and meticulous jurists. They have not produced figures comparable to the great rationalist reformers of other traditions simply because their entire system views philosophical speculation as an unlawful innovation that leads believers away from the truth.
But consider this here as the ultimate catch. If you tell people not to blindly follow the classical imams like Abu Hanifa or Imam Malik, but then everyday modern followers just blindly accept whatever contemporary scholars like Nasruddin al-Albani or Zubair Ali-Zai say is an authentic hadith, isn't that just a brand new flavor of blind following?
It absolutely is, and this is the most potent sociological critique of the movement. It was most notably articulated by traditional scholars like the late Sheikh Ramadan al-Buti.
What was his main argument?
He pointed out the inescapable reality of the masses. The average Ahl-i Hadith follower working in a shop or an office today does not have the decades of training in Arabic linguistics, historical context, and biographical evaluation required to actually perform independent ijtihading.
Right, they can't just read an ancient Arabic text and know the historical context.
Exactly. So when a modern Salafi or Ahl-i Hadith scholar posts a video saying, "This hadith is weak, stop doing this practice," the average follower just obeys without question.
Which al-Buti and others argue is functionally indistinguishable from taqlid blind following.
Yes, you have simply swapped out a classical, centuries-tested imam for a contemporary hadith scholar. The theory they preach is independent reasoning, but the sociological reality, for millions of everyday followers, is total deference to a new, much narrower set of modern authorities.
Let's shift to something the sources highlight as incredibly complex and honestly quite jarring: the political evolution of the movement. Because it starts with blood on a literal battlefield and ends up somewhere completely different.
The transformation is staggering. As we discussed earlier, the intellectual forebears, Syed Ahmad Barelvi and Shah Ismail, died on a battlefield at Balakot in 1831, waging an armed jihad to establish an Islamic state.
They were holy warriors.
They were.
But then 1857 happens, the Great Rebellion against the British Empire. You would think a movement born in the fires of jihad would be leading the charge on the front lines against the British.
But they weren't. In the aftermath of 1857, the surviving leadership made a highly calculated, pragmatic pivot. They became remarkably quietist.
Quietist meaning they just steered out of politics.
Yes, they looked at the geopolitical reality and realized that taking up arms against the British Empire was suicidal for the Muslim community. Sayyid Nazir Hussain, the great institutionalizer of the movement, actually issued a fatwa declaring that participation in the 1857 rebellion was a sin.
A sin. He called a rebellion against colonial occupiers a sin.
He did. He called it a breach of covenant.
That is a massive paradox. How did he justify that?
It was incredibly controversial, but Nazir Hussain argued from classical Islamic jurisprudence. He stated that under British rule, Muslims had the religious freedom to pray, fast, and preach their faith. And according to classical rulings, if a state grants you religious freedom and security, armed rebellion against that state is strictly prohibited.
That is a huge shift in mindset.
The irony goes even deeper. Some Ahl-i Hadith leaders actually referred to British law as God's mercy.
Wait, God's mercy. They called the British colonizers God's mercy.
Yes, because the secular British law dismantled the power of the traditional Hanafi rulers. Under British secularism, the Ahl-i Hadith were completely free to practice their purified, controversial version of Islam and build their own mosques without interference or persecution from the Hanafi majority establishment.
Ah, so the British neutrality actually protected them. Exactly. The British desire for religious neutrality inadvertently shielded this minority sect from being crushed by the traditional majority.
So they became completely apolitical and focused entirely on building schools and preaching. But we have to address the taboo topic here, and we need to do it with strict academic impartiality based entirely on the sociological data in the study.
Right.
Fast forward to the modern era, and the Ahl-i Hadith ideology is frequently mentioned in the same breath as certain militant groups. What does the research actually say about this?
The sources demand a very careful, objective distinction here. The mainstream Ahl-i Hadith movement, its major scholarly bodies, and the vast majority of its millions of followers globally do not endorse terrorism or militancy.
Alhamdulillah, the vast majority are just everyday people focusing on their faith and their families.
Absolutely. They operate as peaceful, politically quietist religious organizations focused heavily on personal piety, theological purity, and charity.
But there is a fringe. However, the uncomfortable truth, documented by security analysts and detailed in our sources, is that there is a militant fringe. The most notorious example is Lashkar-e-Taiba, or Leti, in Pakistan.
Where did Leti come from?
Leti was founded in the late 1980s by individuals, most notably Hafiz Saeed, who emerged directly from Ahl-i Hadith educational and ideological backgrounds. The organization heavily utilized Ahl-i Hadith theology in its early days to recruit, mobilize, and justify its actions.
So how did a quietist scholarly movement that praised British law spawn an armed militant group?
The research shows it wasn't purely theological, it was heavily geopolitical. The sources are clear that Leti received significant support, funding, and direction from Pakistan's intelligence services, the ISI, to wage proxy warfare.
Proxy warfare against who?
First against the Soviets in Afghanistan and later against India and Kashmir. The state utilized the existing Ahl-i Hadith networks, their organizational discipline, and their rigid theology for the state's own strategic ends.
So if you think about it, it's like they built a very strict, highly pressurized theological container. Mainstream followers used that container to focus purely on their personal faith.
Right.
But for a tiny fringe, when a powerful state actor injects political grievances, proxy warfare, and funding into that literalist container, it becomes a recipe for radicalization.
That is excellent synthesis of the sociological data. Scholars note that the movement's inherent binary worldview is a major vulnerability.
Binary worldview.
Yes, when your theology teaches that everything is either pure monotheism or it is heresy, and you are taught to view the majority of other Muslims who disagree with you as deviants, it creates a psychological opening.
An us versus them mindset.
Precisely. If a geopolitical actor then injects political warfare into that rigid us versus them mindset, the psychological leap to armed militancy becomes much easier for a radicalized minority.
Bringing us fully into the 21st century, how does a movement that is entirely built on literal interpretations of ancient texts navigate the dizzying complexity of the modern world?
They navigate it with significant difficulty in certain areas and with surprising, almost paradoxical success in others.
Let's talk about the difficult areas first.
Because they reject analogical reasoning and insist on literal textual evidence, they struggle immensely to create systematic frameworks for entirely novel, modern problems.
So if they encounter a completely modern problem, like genetic engineering or global climate change, they can't just draw a philosophical analogy to something the prophet did. How do they even process that?
Often, they don't process it on a systemic level. Take evolutionary biology, for instance. Traditional Ahl-i Hadith scholars categorically reject Darwinian evolution regarding human origins, sticking strictly to a literal reading of the creation narratives in the texts.
What about environmental issues?
Or look at environmentalism. While the Quran clearly has ecological teachings, the movement's scholarly output lacks a systematic environmental theology. Their focus remains intensely on ritual purity, correct creed, and avoiding religious innovation, not on climate change activism.
And what about evolving social norms?
This is where they clash most heavily with secular democratic norms and progressive interpretations of human rights. Because their literalism binds them strictly to classical jurisprudential rulings, they reinforce highly traditional patriarchal gender roles.
How does that look in practice?
Their rulings on inheritance, female testimony, and women's public participation remain strictly conservative, and they largely reject any modernist or feminist attempts to reinterpret the texts based on changing historical contexts.
This actually brings up a really surprising fact from the research. Given their initial emphasis on bypassing blind tradition, going back to the source, and using independent reasoning, you might logically think they would foster a culture of scientific inquiry.
You would think so.
But the research points out a massive scientific deficit.
Yes, sociological data is glaring on this point. The movement has not produced a distinct corpus of scientists, inventors, or medical pioneers. There are no Nobel laureates in the sciences associated with the Ahl-i Hadith movement.
Why is that the case? If they wanted to break the stagnation of the past, why didn't they embrace the sciences?
It loops right back to their epistemological ceiling we talked about earlier. Their educational institutions, their vast networks of madrasas, are intensely, almost exclusively focused on the religious sciences.
So they just study the texts.
Right. The brilliant minds in their movement are tasked with memorizing the Quran, mastering the intricacies of classical Arabic grammar, and grading the biographical chains of Hadith narrators. They simply do not prioritize the secular natural sciences, philosophy, or the humanities.
Because it relies on human reason.
Exactly. Because those fields rely on human reason, which they view as inherently fallible compared to divine text.
But wait, despite this intense traditionalism, they aren't exactly hiding from the modern world. In fact, the sources show they are incredibly dominant in the digital space.
This is perhaps their most fascinating modern paradox. The Ahl-i Hadith and the broader Salafi movement they align with have been remarkably adept at utilizing cutting-edge technology. While they might struggle with modern philosophy, they have absolutely mastered modern media.
We are talking about figures like Dr. Zakir Naik.
Exactly. Figures like Zakir Naik utilized satellite television, most notably Peace TV, and later fully capitalized on YouTube and social media algorithms to aggressively spread a Salafi-aligned Ahl-i Hadith message.
And it worked.
It worked incredibly well. They created massive global platforms that outpaced the traditional schools for years.
Why does their specific theological message work so incredibly well online? Why do the algorithms love it?
Because the internet algorithmically rewards clarity, brevity, and absolute certainty. Imagine you are a young Muslim living in the diaspora in London or New York, or an urban professional in Lahore. Navigating the ethical and social complexities of modern life is deeply confusing.
It is.
The traditional madhabs, with their nuanced, culturally embedded legal rulings, can seem overly complex or alien. The Ahl-i Hadith online presence offers a streamlined, completely unambiguous product.
It's like, here is the exact question, here is the exact translation of the Hadith, here is the binary answer of what you must do.
Exactly. It strips away the cultural baggage and the centuries of debate. It provides an appealingly simple, black-and-white operating manual for life, which is highly seductive for a youth demographic looking for an anchor in a chaotic modern world.
So, synthesizing all of this massive research, what is the ultimate legacy of the Ahl-i Hadith movement? It feels like a legacy built on massive contradictions.
It really is.
On one hand, mashallah, they truly democratized religion. They told the ordinary person, you have the brain and the right to read the text yourself. You don't need to blindly follow a scholar who lived 1,000 years ago, and you don't need to pay a shrine custodian to pray for you.
They absolutely challenged the monopoly of the classical scholarly elite and cut through the financial exploitation of popular religion. But in doing so, as historians and sociologists note, they inadvertently created new forms of authoritarianism.
How so?
By insisting on a rigidly literalist interpretation heavily fueled in the modern era by Saudi petrodollars, they significantly narrowed the scope of acceptable Islamic practice.
They succeeded in purging a lot of syncretism and superstition from South Asian Islam, but their critics passionately argue that in the process, they lost the spiritual warmth, the poetry, the cultural integration, and the profound mystical depth of the Sufi tradition.
And while they championed ijtihad and independent thought to break the stagnation of the 19th century, They restricted the tools of that thought so severely that they walled themselves off from engaging deeply with the philosophical, ethical, and scientific realities of the 21st century.
They became what they fought against.
In a way, yes. They're a movement built entirely on challenging authority, which has ironically become an authority fiercely protective of its own literalistic boundaries.
Which leaves us with a fascinating, lingering question to consider. If the Ahl-i Hadith movement's entire foundation is built on rejecting the consensus of the past to find the pure original truth, what happens when future generations apply that exact same critical lens to the Ahl-i Hadith movement itself? If your core operating principle is constant textual disruption, can you ever achieve lasting stability?
That is the question they will have to answer.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.